February 1943. The South Pacific burns beneath a rising sun. From a carrier deck off the Solomon Islands, a blue-gray fighter roars into the air. Its gull-shaped wings glint against the sea, its massive propeller slicing through humid clouds. Below, crewmen watch silently as the plane wobbles on takeoff, nearly stalls, then vanishes into the horizon. Someone mutters the nickname that has already stuck: the Ensign Eliminator. It was supposed to be the future of naval aviation, the most powerful single-engine fighter ever built. But so far, it's been a disaster. Too fast for carrier decks, too heavy to land safely, and too unpredictable for the pilots who fly it. The U.S. Navy has quietly grounded most of them. Some commanders even want the whole project scrapped. And yet, out there over the endless Pacific, something begins to change. The same machine that once terrified its own pilots starts cutting through Japanese skies like a blade of vengeance. The Vought F4U Corsair, once ridiculed as a failure, is about to become the deadliest nightmare the enemy will ever face. The story of the Corsair begins years before that fateful takeoff over the Pacific, back in 1938, when the world was holding its breath and the U.S. Navy was racing against time. Europe teetered on the edge of war, and across the Pacific, Japan's empire was expanding fast. Naval aviation was becoming the new measure of power, and the Navy wanted a fighter that could dominate the sea and sky alike. At the Vought Aircraft Company in Connecticut, a 40-year-old engineer named Rex Beisel accepted the challenge. His vision was bold: build the fastest, most powerful carrier-based fighter on Earth. No half measures, no compromises. To do it, he would use the most formidable engine America had ever produced: the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row 18-cylinder radial capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. It was an audacious choice. The engine was massive, nearly as wide as a man was tall, and it demanded an enormous propeller, more than 13 feet across, to harness its power. Mounting that on a fighter small enough for carrier decks was an engineering puzzle bordering on insanity. Beisel's solution was revolutionary: the inverted gull wing. By bending the wings downward, where they joined the fuselage, and upward again at the tips, the Corsair could mount its giant propeller without needing absurdly long landing gear. The design looked strange, almost bird-like, but it worked. When the prototype, the XF4U-1, rolled out in 1940, it looked unlike anything else in the sky. Long nose, wide wings, powerful stance. And when test pilot Lyman Bullard took it up for the first time, it didn't just fly, it shattered records. The Corsair became the first U.S. fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. For a moment, Vaught's hangar erupted in celebration. It seemed the Navy's new king of the sky had arrived. But triumph soon turned to turmoil. The Corsair's engine torque was brutal. Its long nose blocked forward visibility, making landings treacherous. On carrier decks, where precision meant survival, that flaw was deadly. Test landings ended in crashes, with aircraft bouncing, skidding, and breaking apart. Pilots described the plane as unforgiving and out to kill you. During early trials aboard the USS Sangamon, the aircraft earned a dark nickname: the Ensign Eliminator. Young pilots, often fresh from flight school, were crashing before they even cleared the deck. The Navy brass took notice. Carrier qualification boards concluded that the Corsair was unfit for naval operations. Instead, the service chose a safer, slower option: the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Corsair, the faster, more advanced fighter, was quietly sidelined. For Vaught's engineers, it was devastating. Years of work, millions of dollars, and the Navy's great hope for air supremacy, all seemingly wasted. In late 1942, the Corsair's production was cut back. and its future looked bleak. But across the Pacific, events were spiraling toward crisis. The Japanese Zero still ruled the skies, its agility unmatched. At Guadalcanal and the Solomons, U.S. pilots fought valiantly but suffered terrible losses. The Marines on the ground begged for more air support, but the Navy's Hellcats and Wildcats were stretched thin. Desperation forced a reconsideration. The Navy might not want the Corsair, but the U.S. Marine Corps did. Marines, operating from rough island airstrips instead of carriers, didn't need perfect deck landings. They needed power, speed, and survivability. And the Corsair offered all three in terrifying abundance. In early 1943, Marine squadrons like VMF 124, led by Major William Giese, began receiving the first operational Corsairs. The pilots weren't thrilled. Stories of crashes had spread across the Pacific like wildfire. But they had little choice. Within weeks, those doubts began to fade. Over the Solomon Islands, the Corsair proved unstoppable. It climbed faster, dove harder, and hit back with a fury no Japanese Zero could match. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns tore through aluminum like paper. In dogfights, it could dive away from danger and then climb back to strike again. What had begun as a rejected experiment was slowly revealing its purpose. The Marines didn't just fly it, they tamed it. They learned to handle the bounce of its landings, to curve their approaches to see past the long nose, to turn its flaws into tactics. And with every sortie, the Corsair's legend grew. The same plane the Navy had once refused to fly was now saving the Pacific front. But redemption would not come easily. The ridicule still lingered, and many in Washington still viewed it as an unstable machine. The Corsair would have to prove itself beyond doubt. Not in tests, but in battle. The proving ground was coming, a new campaign over coral reefs and volcanic islands where the ridiculed machine would either rise into legend or disappear forever. By mid-1943, the Marines had made the Corsair their own. What began as a hand-me-down from the Navy was quickly proving to be something far greater. On the coral runways of the Solomon Islands, mechanics worked barefoot in the heat, tuning those massive R2800 double wasp engines with wrenches scalded by the sun. Every flight was a risk. The airstrips were short, rough, and framed by palm trees that punished even a small mistake. Yet in those skies, the Corsair began to show its true nature. The first decisive tests came over Bougainville and Rabaul, where Marine squadrons flew repeated strikes against heavily defended Japanese strongholds. Enemy pilots still flew the feared A6M-0, a masterpiece of agility that had humiliated every Allied fighter in the Pacific since 1941. On paper, the Corsair should not have stood a chance. It was heavier, less nimble, and twice as large. But the Pacific wasn't a classroom. It was a proving ground of extremes. What the Corsair lacked in grace, it repaid in brute strength. It could dive faster than the Zero could follow. It could absorb punishment that would shred lighter planes to ribbons. And it could climb away, its engine howling, long after the enemy's speed bled away. Pilots learned to fight on its terms, never turning, always striking from above, using the Corsair's weight like a weapon. One of those pilots was Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, a wiry Marine with a mischievous grin and a fighter's heart. Leading VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, he turned the Corsair into a symbol of American audacity. Boyington didn't see a monster. He saw potential. He drilled his men ruthlessly, teaching them to use the Corsair's climb, dive, and 650 caliber guns to their full potential. In less than 6 months, his unit shot down over 100 Japanese aircraft. The legend of the Blue Devil was born. Japanese intelligence reports began describing the Corsair as a new type, faster, higher, nearly invulnerable. Pilots who once mocked its shape now painted its wing edges white to frighten enemies before the first burst of fire. The gull-winged brute had become a psychological weapon, but it was not only the Marines who noticed. Across the Pacific, the Navy was re-evaluating its decision. The war had changed. The Hellcat, though reliable, was reaching its limits against the evolving Zero. Reports from the front painted a clear picture. The Corsair was outperforming every other Allied fighter in kill ratios and survivability. In early 1944, Navy test pilots revisited the aircraft with fresh eyes. Vought engineers had quietly addressed its worst flaws: a longer tail wheel, better shock absorbers, and refined landing gear that tamed its infamous bounce. The cockpit visibility, once criticized, was improved with a raised seat and a new canopy. The Corsair, once banned from carriers, now began qualifying for them. For Beisel and his team, it was vindication beyond words. What had once been a mechanical embarrassment was now turning into the Navy's crown jewel. The ridiculed fighter had come full circle, its rebirth sealed not in theory, but in fire and blood. By the time the Corsair joined carrier operations in late 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most violent phase, the push toward the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The aircraft that had been laughed off Navy decks 2 years earlier now led the strikes that would decide the fate of the Pacific. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a symbol of what persistence could build. The Corsair's journey from rejection to dominance mirrored the war itself. A struggle of adaptation, of learning through failure. Every engineer, every mechanic, every pilot who once cursed it now found pride in its thunder. But the ultimate test still waited ahead. The moment when the Corsair would meet its true purpose: to break the enemy's will entirely and turn the sky itself into a weapon. The ridiculed machine had risen. Now it would have to prove that it could end wars. To understand how the Corsair transformed from embarrassment to legend, we must see it from every angle, not just as a machine of steel and oil, but as a story of men, design, and defiance. It was a weapon born from ridicule, shaped by human will, and perfected by necessity. When the Corsair first arrived in the South Pacific, it was a riddle wrapped in intimidation. Pilots had heard the rumors about the crashes, the brutal torque, the unpredictable bounce on landing. Some refused to fly it altogether. Others climbed into its cockpit knowing full well that one mistake could be their last. But for the Marine aviators of 1943, fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. The Japanese Zero still owned the daylight. Their task was to take it back. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington became the embodiment of that challenge. At 31, he was old by fighter pilot standards, a brawler in both the air and on the ground. He took command of VMF 214, a ragtag unit of replacements and rejects, and molded them into killers. Boyington understood the Corsair's temperament. "Treat her rough," he told his men. "She likes it that way." And he was right. Once mastered, the F4U responded like a living creature unleashed. Its climb rate was astonishing, its dive unstoppable, and its firepower overwhelming. Boyington's squadron tore through the skies over Rabaul, racking up 94 aerial victories in less than 3 months. To the Japanese, they were Whistling Death, a name that stuck, born from the eerie scream of air rushing through the Corsair's wing root intakes during a dive. But behind the triumph lay exhaustion, loss, and unrelenting pressure. The Marines flew daily sorties from dirt strips carved out of jungles, battling heat, corrosion, and constant Japanese raids. Every takeoff meant trusting a machine that once killed its own pilots. Every landing meant gambling with the deck's uneven coral surface. Yet, through that grind, a strange loyalty formed. Pilots began to trust the Corsair, not because it was gentle, but because it was honest. It could take punishment no other fighter could. It didn't forgive carelessness, but it always gave back what you demanded of it. In the words of one Marine, "You didn't fly the Corsair. You wrestled it. And if you won, you owned the sky." The Corsair's beauty was hidden beneath its violence. Its design made no compromises. Every curve, every bolt existed for a reason, even if those reasons weren't understood at first. The heart of the beast was its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the same power plant that would also drive the P-47 Thunderbolt. It delivered over 2,000 horsepower to a massive three-bladed propeller nearly 13 feet in diameter. No fighter in the world carried more power on a single engine. But that power came with consequences. The engine's torque twisted the aircraft violently to the left on takeoff. The long nose, necessary to house the engine, stretched over 13 feet ahead of the cockpit, making forward visibility nearly non-existent during landings. To offset these traits, Vought engineers designed the inverted gull wing, allowing shorter landing gear and maintaining ground clearance for the massive propeller. It looked strange, even comical, but it gave the Corsair its unmistakable silhouette. Yet the brilliance of its design wasn't just aesthetic. It was functional in ways few anticipated. The thick wings provided exceptional internal space for ammunition and fuel, while the air-cooled engine proved nearly indestructible in battle. Bullets that would cripple liquid-cooled aircraft barely slowed it down. In many cases, Corsairs returned home missing cylinders, riddled with shrapnel, engines coughing but still alive. Engineers at Vought called it overbuilt. Pilots called it immortal. And when ground crews saw what it could carry, they realized it was more than a fighter. The Corsair could lift bombs, rockets, and drop tanks with ease. By 1944, it was carrying 2,000-pound bombs, the same payload as some medium bombers. That versatility made it a nightmare for the Japanese. It could shoot, bomb, strafe, and climb, all in the same mission. The plane that once scared its own pilots now terrified entire divisions. The Corsair's duality, its human defiance and mechanical genius, defined it. Pilots learned to respect its quirks. Engineers refined its flaws. And together they forged a new kind of warfare, fast, flexible, merciless. And as word of its success spread, another perspective emerged, the one from below. Because while the Marines celebrated their newfound dominance, Japanese troops on the islands began whispering a single name with dread: Whistling Death. From the ground, the Corsair was not a plane, it was a storm. Japanese soldiers stationed across Bougainville, Rabaul, and the Marshall Islands described its arrival with dread. The deep growl of the double Wasp engine would begin as a faint vibration, then rise to a shriek as the gull-winged shadow sliced through the clouds. By the time anyone looked up, it was already too late. To the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Service, the Corsair was an enigma. Its unusual wing design and blinding speed defied recognition. Pilots who engaged it in the air reported a terrifying pattern. The American fighter appeared from high altitude, dove like a meteor, and vanished again before a counterattack could form. The once invincible Mitsubishi A6M-0 had finally met an enemy it could not outturn, outclimb, or outrun. In vertical maneuvers, the Corsair ruled. Its dive speed exceeded 500 miles per hour, a velocity the lightweight Zero could never follow without structural failure. Even when hit, the Corsair refused to die. Captured Japanese reports recovered after the war included chilling comments. It dives like a stone, then rises like a demon. It is useless to shoot at it. The bullets bounce. The myth of the Zero's invincibility, built through years of triumph, began to collapse under the Corsair's relentless thunder. The enemy started calling it Whistling Death, a phrase born not from propaganda, but from fear itself. By 1944, the psychological toll was as real as the physical. Japanese convoys moved only at night, terrified of that unmistakable engine note echoing through the tropic air. And for good reason. Once the Corsairs came, nothing moved again. When the Corsair entered its stride, it redefined what a fighter could do. It wasn't just a duelist, it was an entire air strategy contained in a single frame. By late 1943, Marine pilots had adapted the Corsair into a multi-role monster. It began as a high-altitude fighter and evolved into a fighter-bomber, a close support aircraft, and even a ship hunter. It could climb to intercept bombers one mission and return hours later to strafe tanks and artillery. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns could fire nearly 2,400 rounds per minute, each tracer cutting orange arcs across jungle skies. Combined with its bomb and rocket loadouts, the Corsair became the Pacific's airborne artillery. On the ground, it changed the very rhythm of war. Infantry now fought with eyes to the sky, coordinating with pilots through radio spotters. Entire assaults at Bougainville and Peleliu were launched only after Corsair strikes had flattened the defenses. The Marines had gained what every commander dreams of: direct, immediate, overwhelming air support. And yet, its dominance wasn't confined to the Pacific Islands. The Corsair saw service with the British Fleet Air Arm in Europe as well. Flying from carriers in the frigid Atlantic, British pilots proved what the U.S. Navy had once thought impossible. The Corsair could operate safely from decks after all. The Royal Navy had simply adjusted its technique, curving approaches to the carrier instead of landing straight on, compensating for the aircraft's long nose. That innovation forced the U.S. Navy to reconsider its earlier rejection. By early 1944, the Corsair was finally recertified for carrier operations, and now even the fleet's admirals wanted it back. The ridicule that had once surrounded it evaporated. From the Solomons to Okinawa, it became the face of American air power. Pilots no longer flew it reluctantly. They fought over who would. In the story of war, machines often outlive the men who fly them. But the Corsair's story carries something deeper: a moral symmetry. It began as a symbol of failure. Engineers mocked its design. The Navy abandoned it. Pilots feared it. Yet, through persistence, the willingness to rework, relearn, and rebuild, it became one of the most effective weapons ever created. Its redemption mirrored that of the Allied struggle itself. Progress through adaptation, victory through endurance. Every rivet, every scar, every improvised fix on the Corsair's blue wings told that story. It was the story of engineers who refused to quit, mechanics who rebuilt wrecks overnight, and pilots who faced fear not by avoiding it, but by mastering it. By 1945, the ridicule was forgotten. The F4U Corsair had achieved what few weapons ever do. It had turned its greatest flaw into its greatest strength. The plane that couldn't land on a carrier had learned to fight from the sky itself, and as 1944 gave way to 1945, it was about to enter the deadliest phase of its life. The great island battles of the Pacific, where its legend would be sealed in fire and thunder. By early 1944, the ridicule surrounding the Corsair had evaporated, replaced by an awe that bordered on reverence. The Marines, who had once received the fighter out of desperation, now treated it as a divine weapon. The Japanese called it whistling death. The Navy, once its harshest critic, quietly began bringing it back to the carrier decks it had been banished from. Its trial by fire came with the brutal campaigns of Tarawa, Truk, and the Marshall Islands, the stepping stones across the Pacific toward Japan. Each island was a fortress, and each demanded the same grim ritual: soften it from the air, crush it from the sea, and bleed for it on the sand. The Corsair would play all three roles at once. At Truk Lagoon in February 1944, Japan's so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, the Corsair found its destiny. Flying off forward airstrips on the Marshalls, Marine and Navy squadrons struck the massive anchorage with a ferocity never seen before. Japanese fighters scrambled in vain. They were shredded mid-climb by the faster, heavier American planes. One Corsair pilot, Lieutenant Robert Bob Hansen of VMF 215, scored 20 kills in just 17 days before his final mission. His aircraft, a blue ghost with shark teeth painted on its cowl, became a symbol of retribution. The enemy's air power, once dominant, was now disintegrating under relentless pressure. But the Corsair's true proving ground was not in duels at altitude. It was in the grinding war just above the jungle canopy. At Bougainville, Green Island, and later Peleliu, Corsairs roared over treetops to deliver firepower so precise that infantry could feel its heat. They strafed pillboxes, convoys, and artillery positions with devastating accuracy. When the Marines on the ground were pinned down, they radioed for angels with the bent wings. And within minutes, the Corsairs appeared, screaming down with rockets and bombs that turned resistance into rubble. The plane that couldn't land safely was now the plane that made every landing on the beach possible. Its taunting versatility redefined the rhythm of battle. Before the Corsair, airstrikes were planned, scheduled, detached. After the Corsair, they were instantaneous. Spotters on the front lines learned to guide attacks with smoke and mirrors, bringing the sky down upon the enemy at will. It was the first time in history that infantry and fighter bombers fought as one. The Japanese began to adapt, digging deeper, camouflaging more carefully, moving only at night. But it was futile. The Corsair owned the daylight. Its 650 caliber guns could tear a transport column to pieces in seconds. Its bombs pulverized bunkers. Its rockets could punch through tank armor like paper. But its most terrifying weapon wasn't its firepower. It was its endurance. It could take hits, lose cylinders, bleed oil, and still fly home. At Rabaul, pilots returned with their wings shredded and their engines coughing flames. Mechanics would patch them overnight with tin, wire, and prayer, and they'd fly again the next morning. The Corsair was an aircraft that refused to die, and that refusal mirrored the Marines who flew it. As word spread of its success, even the skeptics were forced to concede. The Corsair had done the impossible. It had conquered both the enemy and its own reputation. By mid-1944, it began flying from U.S. Navy carriers in large numbers. The same decks that once banned it now launched entire squadrons of them. The British Fleet Air Arm, which had already tamed its tricky landings through curved approaches, had proven it was possible. The Americans perfected it. Now, the Corsair was everywhere. From island runways to carrier strike groups, escorting bombers, strafing convoys, and sinking ships. It had become not just a fighter, but a symbol of Allied air mastery. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Corsair joined the great aerial slaughter that history would call the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier air groups, once the terror of Pearl Harbor, were annihilated in a single day. More than 400 enemy planes fell, many to Corsairs whose pilots, 2 years earlier, had been told their plane was unfit for naval service. No one was laughing now. By the end of 1944, the Pacific had changed. The Corsair had turned from a misunderstood brute into the undisputed predator of the skies. It had outlasted the Zero, outperformed the Hellcat, and outshone every fighter that came before it. But its final test still lay ahead. A crucible of kamikazes, carriers, and firestorms, where it would have to face an enemy that no tactics could predict and no armor could fully withstand. Because the war was entering its final, desperate phase, and the Corsair would have to become something more than just a weapon. It would have to become a shield. By 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final brutal act. The enemy, cornered but unbroken, began fighting with a new and terrifying weapon. Men who turned themselves into bombs. The kamikaze, the Corsair, already feared as a hunter, now became a guardian. It was the last line of defense between suicide aircraft and the fragile decks of Allied carriers. The same fighter once labeled unfit for carriers was now the very machine saving them. During the Battle of Okinawa in April 1945, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, hundreds of Corsairs flew in rotating shifts from carriers and land bases. They launched at dawn, patrolling the horizon for glints of wings and rising specks, kamikazes diving out of the sun. For weeks, the sky became a battlefield of speed, nerve, and split-second judgment. The Japanese threw more than 1,500 suicide planes into the fight. The Corsairs met them all. Lieutenant Dean Caswell, flying from the carrier USS Bunker Hill, recalled seeing a kamikaze descending straight for his ship. "You didn't think," he said later. "You just turned into it." He dove head-on, guns blazing, tearing the attacker apart before it reached the deck. A dozen others did the same that day, often firing until the wreckage brushed their wingtips. Those who failed to intercept paid the price. When two kamikazes struck Bunker Hill on May 11th, the explosions engulfed the flight deck, killing nearly 400 sailors. Yet within hours, surviving Corsairs were taking off again from the damaged ship, engines howling through black smoke, hunting for vengeance. The enemy had turned the sky into chaos. The Corsair answered with order. In the final months of the war, it flew more sorties than any other U.S. naval aircraft. Its pilots destroyed over 2,100 Japanese planes, sank ships, and struck airfields across Kyushu. It was everywhere, escorting B-29s, diving through flak to hit hangars, strafing airfields so fiercely that even Japanese commanders called daylight operations impossible. The irony was profound. The Navy's once rejected fighter had become its shield against annihilation. Even Japan's surviving aces began to respect it. One Zero pilot, captured after the war, reportedly said, "When we saw the bent wings, we knew we were already dead." The Corsair's kill-to-loss ratio stood at an astonishing 11-1, one of the highest in aviation history. Its pilots, hardened by years of combat, had become experts at both offense and defense. They knew the feel of every vibration, the rhythm of every dive. In their hands, the Corsair wasn't just a machine, it was an extension of instinct. Mechanics, too, played their part in this final crescendo. On the carriers and on coral airstrips, they worked around the clock under floodlights, patching bullet holes with scrap aluminum, refueling with manual pumps, loading rockets by hand. Every repaired Corsair meant another sortie, another life saved. The bond between pilot and crew had become almost sacred. When Okinawa finally fell in June 1945, victory had come at a staggering cost. The island was secure, but the price was nearly 50,000 Allied casualties. And yet, without the Corsairs that filled the sky every hour of daylight, that number might have been doubled. In August, when atomic fire consumed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Corsair was still on patrol, hunting convoys that would never arrive, guarding fleets that no longer needed guarding. It had outlived its purpose, yet it kept flying, as if unwilling to accept that the war was over. When peace was declared, pilots stood beside their bent-wing companions in silence. Some wept. Others simply ran their hands over the metal that had saved them time and again. The Corsair had come full circle. From rejection to redemption, from ridicule to reverence, it had survived carrier crashes, bureaucratic doubt, and the deadliest war in human history, and emerged as one of the greatest fighting machines ever built. In every respect, It was more than a weapon. It was proof. Proof that perseverance could outlast perfection. That the ugly, overbuilt thing people laughed at could become the savior of thousands. And as the Pacific fell silent, the blue silhouette of the Corsair still prowled the sky. Bent-wing angel standing guard over the peace it had earned. The war's end brought silence to the Pacific, a silence that felt unreal after years of fire and thunder. The beaches that once trembled beneath the Corsair's rockets now shimmered with morning light. The roar of the double wasp faded into memory, replaced by the murmur of rebuilding. But the legacy of the F4U Corsair was written across the islands it had fought for. In the wrecked Zeros, the shattered airfields, and the stories whispered by every Marine who survived because it came when they called. By August 1945, the numbers spoke for themselves. The Corsair had flown over 64,000 combat sorties, destroyed over 2,100 Japanese aircraft, and maintained a kill ratio exceeding 11-1, one of the highest of any Allied fighter in history. It had bombed ships, strafed convoys, sunk supply barges, and shielded carrier groups from kamikaze attacks. The same plane once grounded as too dangerous to fly had become the deadliest guardian of the fleet. But beyond statistics, the Corsair's reputation carried something intangible: respect. From Marine forward observers on the ground to admirals on the bridge, everyone who witnessed its work understood that it wasn't just another aircraft. It was the aircraft, the defining symbol of American adaptability, stubbornness, and grit. For pilots, it was something more personal. They spoke of the Corsair not as a tool, but as a companion. Lieutenant Dean Caswell, who flew 60 combat missions, once said, "If you treated her right, she'd bring you home no matter what." Many had stories of limping back on one wing, of engines spitting oil yet still pulling them toward the horizon. Mechanics could patch bullet holes, but they could never patch the faith that pilots had in that machine. The Marines who depended on it knew its sound better than their own heartbeat. When pinned under fire, they'd press their faces into the dirt and listen for that deep, rising thunder, the sound that meant salvation. In letters home, soldiers described it as the voice of the sky, a sound that turned terror into hope. Even the enemy acknowledged its power. Captured Japanese pilots told Allied interrogators that they feared the Corsair above all others. "The blue one with bent wings," one prisoner said. "It comes down faster than you can look up. It kills you before you breathe again." When peace came, many Corsairs sat weathered and stained on Pacific airstrips, their engines cooling in the tropical sun. Some would fly home aboard carriers. Others would be abandoned to rust among the palms. For the men who had flown them, leaving them behind was harder than they expected. Because the Corsair wasn't just a plane anymore. It had become a presence. For America, the Corsair represented a new era, one in which industrial design and battlefield experience fused into unstoppable innovation. It proved that no amount of ridicule, no early failure, could define a machine's fate if it was built with courage and refined through persistence. It was a reminder that victory doesn't always come from what works immediately, but from what refuses to be given up on. And though the Corsair's wings were bent, they never broke. It had risen from mockery to mastery, and in doing so, had written one of the most powerful redemption stories in aviation history. But the story didn't end in 1945. The Corsair's service was far from over. New wars and new skies awaited, and the machine once laughed at was about to prove it could survive even peace. Peace may have ended the battles, but it did not end the Corsair's flight. When the Pacific finally fell silent, thousands of F4Us lined the airfields of Guam, Okinawa, and Hawaii, rows upon rows of bent wings gleaming beneath the tropical sun. Many believed they would soon be scrapped, relics of a war too brutal to remember. But fate had other plans. The post-war world still needed strength. New conflicts emerged, and the Corsair was too good to retire. In 1950, just 5 years after the war's end, the blue silhouette once again filled the skies, this time over the Korean peninsula. The terrain was different, the weather harsher, but the mission was the same: protect the men on the ground. Once more, the Corsair excelled. Its rugged airframe and massive engine made it perfect for low-altitude attack runs over enemy lines. While sleek new jets screamed overhead at supersonic speeds, it was often the old, propeller-driven Corsairs that did the dirty work. Close air support, precision strikes, and nighttime raids. They carried bombs, napalm, and rockets, striking North Korean convoys and artillery positions with terrifying accuracy. Marine pilots once again trusted the same machine their fathers had flown a decade earlier. In a world of jets, it was a piston-powered ghost, slower, louder, but impossible to kill. By the end of the Korean War, the Corsair had flown more than 80,000 sorties and earned a new reputation: the plane that outlived its own generation. Meanwhile, across the world, the Corsair found new homes. France, Britain, Honduras, and even El Salvador flew the fighter well into the 1960s and 70s. In the Soccer War of 1969, 2 Corsairs, one Honduran, one Salvadoran, faced each other in the world's last-ever propeller-versus-propeller dogfight. The machine that had begun its life mocked for instability had survived long enough to fight its own reflection. But its influence reached beyond its wings. The lessons learned from its flaws, its torque, its landing bounce, its raw power, reshaped how engineers thought about aircraft design. It taught them that survivability mattered as much as speed, that an aircraft's strength lay not only in its performance, but in its forgiveness. That philosophy lived on decades later, when Fairchild Republic unveiled the A-10 Thunderbolt II, Sadentertidre Danmanitutu, the ground attack jet of the Cold War. Its creators named it in tribute to the P-47 Thunderbolt, but its soul, its brute practicality, and its unbreakable spirit came straight from the Corsair. You could see it in the design: the A-10's durability, its oversized engine pods, its refusal to die even when torn apart by enemy fire. It was the Corsair reborn for a new century. Another ugly, overbuilt, unstoppable savior for the men on the ground. Back in America, the few surviving WWII Corsairs became prized relics. Veterans restored them, collectors flew them at air shows, and engineers studied their designs. At each demonstration, the crowd would fall silent when that familiar sound, the deep, rolling thunder of the R2800 engine, broke across the field. It was more than nostalgia. It was respect. Every rivet, every scar, every twist of those bent wings carried a truth the war had taught too well: that greatness isn't always born perfect. Sometimes it's forged through rejection, shaped by persistence, and proven in fire. When the last Corsair flew its final show, it didn't feel like a farewell. It felt like a promise that no matter how advanced the machines of the future became, their courage would still be measured by the same rule the Corsair had lived by: never quit, no matter the odds. From a design room in Connecticut to the beaches of Okinawa and the mountains of Korea, the Corsair's journey spanned not just decades, but generations of belief. It began as the Navy's failure. It ended as the world's legend. The ridiculed plane had fulfilled its destiny, not just by conquering the enemy, but by conquering doubt itself. History often forgets the things that stumble before they soar. The Corsair was one of them, born from ridicule, scarred by failure, and carried to greatness not by perfection, but by persistence. It was a machine that dared to be different, and in doing so, it became immortal. When it first took flight, the Navy called it reckless. Pilots called it dangerous. Engineers called it overbuilt. Yet by the end of the war, the world called it victory. Its bent wings became a symbol of defiance, of what happens when determination outlasts doubt. The Corsair's thunder rolled from the Solomons to Okinawa, from Rabaul's jungles to Korea's frozen hills. It was there in every scream of its 6 guns, every dive that split the sky, every soldier who looked up and whispered thanks when its shadow passed overhead. It did not promise beauty. It promised survival. And it kept that promise. Even now, when one of its restored survivors takes to the air, people stop and look up. The sound is the same as it was 8 decades ago, a rolling growl that seems to come from the bones of the earth itself. For a moment, you can almost see it again. The flash of sun on those bent wings, the shimmer of heat rising from the Pacific, the echo of men who once trusted their lives to its roar. The Corsair's story is not just about a plane. It's about resilience, about how ridicule can become reverence, how failure can forge triumph. It's the story of every engineer who refused to quit, every pilot who learned to master fear, every generation that discovers strength in the things the world once laughed at. Because in the end, history is not written by perfection. It's written by endurance. The Vought F4U Corsair didn't just fly through the war. It flew through doubt, through ridicule, through the limits of human invention, and came out the other side as legend. It was the plane that should have failed, but instead, it conquered the sky.